So now, switching hats a little bit, I want to talk about the first paper topic, which is labor markets and poverty in the U.S. And this is joint work with UC Davis graduate student Ariel Peel, who has worked alongside me to produce the white paper. So the topic today is really to focus on one aspect of poverty, and that is the intersection of U.S. labor markets and poverty, and how those two, the state of labor markets, conditions of labor markets, individuals' preparation, can affect how much poverty we see and what the nature of that poverty is. So I want to start with one number, and so $18,850, what that number represents, that is the U.S. poverty threshold. I think it's from 2014, so a little bit out of date, for a family of 3 in the U.S. So that is an extremely imperfect measure, but what we use for official purposes in the U.S. to say how much annual income a family of 3 would need to meet their basic necessities. It's a very sort of controversial figure, but that's just, think of that as a starting point. So what I want to do is I'm going to spend a few minutes just really summarizing some facts about the state of the U.S. labor market in relation to poverty, and then I'll move to talk about policies and research and where we think we need to know more. So to compare with that $18,850 figure, so if you look in 2014 in the U.S., if you take the lowest 20% of workers, at the top of that 20%, so the worker who earns less than 80% of other workers but more than 19.999%, their hourly wage is roughly $10 an hour, $9.99. The big overview of labor markets in the U.S. is that that number has barely budged since about the mid-1980s, in real terms adjusted for inflation. It came down dramatically through to the mid-90s, then rebounded a bit in the large recovery we had in the late 1990s, and then has gone back down over the course of the Great Recession. So we've been at around $10 for decades now. So if you think about that number in relation to what we think of as poverty in the U.S., and remember, this is at the top of the 20%, of the bottom 20%. So if you multiply that, suppose that someone earning that wage was able to work every week of the year for 40 hours a week, that would get them to a little over $20,000. So just over that poverty threshold. Now, of course, most low-wage workers do not work 52 weeks a year or 40 hours a week. So another thing to benchmark is if you think about the average hours of work for everyone who's working in the U.S. economy, is slightly below 2,000, and so then if you multiply that hourly rate, you get something right around that poverty threshold. Now, if you take average hours of work for the bottom 20% of wage earners, you get a substantially lower number, around $15,000. But this is just to set ideas that at our current reality in the labor market, and the reality that has been here for decades now, it is quite possible, even with full-time or close to full-time work, that a family will not be above the poverty line. So to just give a little more context to this concept of the working poor and what we mean, I want to start by just asking the simple question, how much do the poor work, and giving a snapshot of how that's changed over the past few decades. So this graph is for a selected group of the U.S. poor population. And these are what we've termed in the paper work-eligible poor. So if you just look at all poor families in the U.S., about 41% of them worked at some point during the past year. So that 60% that didn't work at all includes some groups that you might not necessarily think policies are going to be able immediately to move to work. And that is individuals who report they didn't work because they were disabled or ill, and those who report being retired. So when we then restrict the sample a little bit to focus on this work-eligible group, which is non-disabled adults of typical working age, then we have, that's the group that's summarized here, and we ask how much that group of the poor worked. You'll see that the yellow lines are in 1990 and the blue are in 2014. So roughly, again, a little under 50% of that population reports no work in the previous year, which of course means that about half of the poor do work, at least for some portion of the year. What's interesting, if you look over time, is you'll see that the fraction not working at all actually increased a little bit. So that 0 weeks category went up a bit from 1990 to 2014. On the other hand, it's not really a simple story, because you also see that at the other end of that graph, the fraction working full year-round, 50 or more weeks out of the year, and still remaining poor, has gone up slightly too. So roughly, a little over 20% work 50 or more weeks a year, but are still in part of this poor population. So I think that sort of tells you it's a little bit complex. Many of the poor do work, but about half of them do not work any hours at all. Another interesting subpopulation of this work-eligible poor that I want to focus on a little bit today, because there have been some really critical changes over the past 30 years for this population, is the group of poor single parents. And here, there's something that's, I think, kind of remarkable that I think many people aren't aware of. And that is, if you look at this group and ask how many do non-disabled, under 65, poor single parents, how much do those people work? You see that from 1990 to 2014, the fraction of that group of poor that worked 0 weeks, didn't work at all in the previous year, fell dramatically. And also striking is that if you look at the fraction of that group who was working all year round, so 50 or more weeks, you see that going from about 15 to more than 30%. So we, as a result of a number of policies over time, have really, I think, had a bit of a national consensus that single parents should work. They should participate in the labor market. And these numbers show that at a very high level, in some sense, there has been a success, if that was our goal, to get more low-income single parents working. We can debate whether that is a goal in isolation that should be pursued, but that is the reality. And so as we think about policies to affect labor markets, address poverty, I think it's important to realize this dramatic movement in the single parent population with respect to work, in the poor single parent population. So there's a flip side, another way that many people think about the relationship between work and poverty. So I've been showing you, if you take the poor population, you can then ask, well, how many of them are working? But another approach is to say, well, if we look at all workers, how many of them are poor? And you can sometimes get a different picture, and I think it's important to acknowledge that that gives you a somewhat different snapshot. So in 2014, if you look at full-time year-round workers, so worked at least 50 weeks out of the year, full-time, the poverty rate is very low, 3%, compared to 15% poverty rate in the US unconditionally. So that does say that if you can get full-time year-round work, your chances of being poor in the US are quite low. The question, of course, is what are the barriers to that full-time year-round work? Another way to look at it is, suppose you have some labor force interruption, and so work part of the year, but maybe not all year, or maybe you're working only full-time. Then the poverty rate among that group is about 7%. And so if you want to think about a quick way to summarize this fact, I would say, the overall poverty rate in the US has been stuck at around 15% for some time. Roughly half of that poverty rate comes from individuals who are substantially connected to the labor market, so about 7%. A final striking statistic that again gets back to the subpopulation that many of our policies address and we spend a lot of time thinking about is that among individuals living in a single parent family, so this is the single parent themselves as well as any children or relatives in the family, among that group, in a family with a single parent who is working, the poverty rate remains 22%. That 38% is if you look at all single parents. Even if you're working as a single parent, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of being poor. So again, that sort of frames, I think, the type of policies we need to think about and the challenges if you think about the challenges of full-time work as a sole caregiver for children. The bottom line is that if you want to ask, well, why is there this intersection between work and poverty in the US? I think it's clear from looking at statistics that it is an issue of certainly limited hours and part-time work and access to jobs, But low wages remain a really important part of the story, particularly in households with only one potential earner, and those are single-parent households. So this is one way to get at this question of, well, is it the level of wages that is keeping so many workers in poverty? Because what this chart does is it just divides US states into three groups. We say, well, there's variation across states in the level of wages, and in particular, in the level of wages near the bottom of the distribution. So this graph says, well, if we categorize states into low, medium, and high, based on what the bottom 20% of wage earners in that state earn, are poverty rates associated with that? The answer is clearly less. So the highest line, where the height of the line measures poverty rates, the highest line is for the lowest wage states. So in states where the wage distribution is lower, especially at the bottom, you see higher poverty. The final quick point to make on this graph, which I think is really important, though it will get into a little bit of statistical detail. One problem with the exercise I just described, thinking about low wage states and high wage states, is that there's variation in price levels across the US. We as Californians certainly know that, living in a relatively high price state. And so what some new measures from the US Census have done is to adjust poverty. And so if you're living in a high price state, that might also be a high wage state. But if you don't account for the high prices, it may not make much sense to compare wages with poverty levels. What a new measure from the US Census has done is to adjust poverty rates to take into account differences in prices. So to acknowledge that it takes more income to get necessities in a high price state, which often tends to be a higher wage state than the low wage. So these very short lines at the end use this new experimental measure to say we're going to adjust the poverty thresholds to take account of the fact that it's just more expensive to live in places. But the key thing is that when you do that, you get exactly the same result. It still matters that even after accounting for differences in the cost of living, if wages for the lowest wage workers are relatively low, poverty rates are highest. That's the top short line there, medium and low. So this is just a way to sort of fix this idea that the level of wages does make a difference for these populations that are sort of struggling to get often just above the poverty line. Okay, so now I have 7 minutes to present some policy ideas, and then we'll turn things over to our panelists. So policy solutions and key research for the future. So I could not give this presentation in California without talking about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a very contentious area in the research community as well as in the policy community. What I want to say is that we are in a sort of new era. California and New York just passed these very large increases in the minimum wage. The academic literature on the minimum wage I would characterize as still being unsettled on the magnitude of potential employment reductions from raising the minimum wage. Some studies find there are little or no effects. Other studies find there is some reduction in employment when minimum wages go up. What I think is really important for us all to acknowledge, and this is my view of the literature admittedly, is that all of what we know in the academic literature is based on quite small adjustments in the minimum wage that we have seen to date. We do not know, we do not have good credible evidence on what happens when you raise the minimum wage from $10 to $15. We don't know if that will change the dynamics. There are certain reasons to think it will. And so this is just a way of saying anyone who claims to know with certainty that the higher minimum wage will have no negative effects, I think is not being realistic. And the same for those who claim it will definitely have negative effects. So that's just a cautionary note. Another important point is to think carefully about local changes versus national and city versus state, because companies can adjust in different ways depending on how broad the coverage is. The key point I wanted to make, because I think it's really important in thinking not about just minimum wage and employment, but minimum wage and poverty, especially in light of what California and New York have done, is that it's not just that taking on much higher minimum wage levels is in sort of unknown territory for academics, But there are a lot of different types of responses we might see as we go, instead of going from $7.75 to $8 or $8 to $8.15, as we go from, say, 10 to 15. And that is that as you move the minimum wage up into a slightly different part of the distribution, you may start to affect a different group of people. So one debate in the academic literature is there are claims that the minimum wage is not an effective anti-poverty policy because so many people who earn the minimum are teenagers or are living with other people, so they're not actually from poor households. I think, again, we don't know a lot about, if we look at a $15 an hour minimum wage, how that's going to intersect with the poor or near poor populations. So that's, again, another area that we have to start to think more carefully about in research and also think about as we start to watch that policy and see what's going to happen. Second key policy, if we're thinking about labor markets and poverty, of course, is the earned income tax credit. Here, the story of research in the past 10 years of academic research is that there is a lot of evidence that higher earned income tax credit receipt seems to have important effects on families' outcomes. It seems to improve children's educational outcomes, improve infant health, and so we're starting to really do a better job of measuring what it means to have a more generous social safety net through this particular program, the Earned Income Tax Credit. We also know that empirically from the research, the Earned Income Tax Credit seems to mainly encourage more participation in the labor market. Theoretically, the EITC could also discourage work effort for some people who are just at a sort of what we call kink point, or a change in the EIT schedule. There's not a lot of evidence that that's a really big effect, but again, that it's there and we always need to have it in mind. The key thing, or the key area for research I'd point to in the EITC is we need to think about what it is doing to the poor or near poor population in the long term. If we think that it's having positive effects on families and kids and outcomes, and know it encourages labor force attachment, it's a great chance to try to understand the difference between a poor family with fairly stable labor force attachment, perhaps encouraged by the EITC, versus a poor family that maybe is more dependent on cash transfer payments. And the reason I think this is important is because while we see positive effects of the EITC, the research community, I would claim, does not understand why we're seeing these positive effects of the Earned Income Tax Credit when we really never saw such clear positive effects from cash transfer programs. Now, we may see some of those now, but we haven't in the past. And the real key is it something about a program that is, by definition, paired with work, which the EITC is, or is it really just a more effective way of giving a small income boost to these families? And that's an important difference if you think about extensions, if you think about other programs that might build on the success, to understand whether it's something about, there's a sociologist who writes about the EITC and talks about its connection with work being important because it enfranchises people into society. There are others, economists, who just say, well, the EITC works because it gets more income into households. And we really need to sort that out if we want to think clearly about how to capitalize on that and continue those gains. Another critical part of thinking about labor markets and poor populations is, of course, how can we take relatively low-income workers and improve their wages and earnings potential? One way, of course, is education. I'm going to just point to what I think has been a very neglected, from an academic area, neglected area of research, and that is looking at vocational education programs that are not traditional academic programs, but are focused on all sorts of trades, from health occupations to construction, welding, childcare, and we have a project trying to understand the returns to those. Key future questions there that we really need to grapple with are, how do individuals in this very confusing set of programs, for-profit schools, community colleges, short-term programs, longer-term programs, how do individuals understand which program is right for them, which program they can succeed in? And again, there I would say academic and policy knowledge in this area is very limited. We just don't know a lot about this, and it's something we're working on to try to understand. Another kind of policy area and need for research is that we know a bit about what at least predicts, if it's not a deep cause, what predicts success in traditional academic settings. It's sometimes things that are almost circular, like high school GPA or test scores. We know very little in these understudied vocational programs about which students can succeed and which students may struggle. We know that many of these programs are, at least in theory, open access, but that doesn't always mean that the students who show up to take them have the skills to be successful in them, and that's again an area that we need to be doing more research on and focusing more. Right. And with 1 minute to go, there is another whole set of employment policies and programs that honestly I think the Great Recession has brought a focus on, and we need to start to study more. And those are really questions about access to full-time employment, long-term employment, and avoiding long-term unemployment. For example, during the Great Recession, we again tried in various cities subsidized employment programs for the long-term unemployed. There have been some evaluations of those, but it's an opportunity to continue to follow up on those evaluations and see if subsidized employment can help workers in the long run. Another thing the Great Recession taught us as a research community is that if we got a lot of focus on long-term unemployment because of the historically high rates of long-term unemployment then. What we've started to study, and some recent research has shown, is that long-term unemployment in itself seems to be sufficiently stigmatizing that we may need to think in particular about how to help workers. If you make fake resumes and send them out, and one has a worker unemployed for 5 months and one for 9 months, the exact same worker with a longer spell of unemployment is less likely to be called back for no other reason than that is sending some sort of signal or stigma. So another area for research. I'll wrap up quickly since I'm now over time and leave it to the panelists to talk more about these last two, but we've really started to learn and understand more about the conditions of low-paid work. Things like, when do workers know their schedule so that they can adjust family demands to be at work? When do they have notice of the need for overtime? How often do they show up for work to be told, oh, your shift has been canceled? So thinking through those policies in a world where we now know 20 to 30% of the workforce may be in jobs like this, I think we're starting to have more of a national conversation about that, and I think academic research on those areas needs to catch up a little bit and really do credible studies of how these policies might limit workers or how improving those policies can improve mobility. And I'll just end by saying California has been a bit of a pioneer in offering paid child care leave in light of the high rates of working poor single parents. This is probably a crucial policy to continue to study. And I will now end my comments and welcome our panel. Please come up and then I'll join you at the table. So to respond to these thoughts, we have Sarah Bohn from the Public Policy Institute of California, Kate Karpilow from the California Center for Research on Women and Families, and Paul McLain-Lugowski from the Fresno Economic Opportunities Commission. And in no predetermined, I guess we'll just go in the order they were introduced. So I'll ask Sarah to start, take 5 to 10 minutes to respond, and we'll go down the row, and then we'll open it up to audience questions.
Thank you, Ann, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really exciting to participate in this this summit. I guess I had a lot of thoughts. This is related really closely to a lot of my research and policy outreach at PPIC. For those of you not familiar with the Public Policy Institute of California, we're a nonprofit, independent research organization focused on improving policy responses in California. So I wanted to kind of maybe focus on 3 kind of big picture policy and research challenges as I see it. One is how policy is targeted at work and poverty. 2 is how policymakers can think a bit more long-term about some of the challenges that they face. And then the last is about kind of some complexity around program overlap and integration. So I think, as Ann made abundantly clear, it's true that work in the US, even full-time work, doesn't eliminate poverty, and even though it is a precondition to a lot of our anti-poverty programs. One of the challenges in that, which Ann mentioned quite a few times, was that poverty is actually hard to measure and define. So trying to think of how to focus policy work on what population and how to address the needs of the working poor is actually more complex than we often think. And there's a lot of research ongoing on this. As Ann mentioned, the supplemental poverty measure work at the Census Bureau, and we at PBIC, in collaboration with some researchers at Stanford, have developed a similar measure for California. Part of the challenge is, how do you think about what resources are needed to make ends meet? Holding a full-time job, it can be expensive. Childcare is expensive, so we try to take that into account. Commuting costs can be expensive too, especially in certain parts of the state. Also, do we think about just wages, or do we think about other forms of compensation? Over the same period of time, the wages have kind of stagnated at the low end. There's also been an increase in non-wage forms of compensation, like health insurance, and maybe that's not really that particularly relevant for the low-wage working poor, but it's something to consider. How do you want to identify workers that are poor so that you can better target programs and policies to meet their needs? Are you thinking about just a self-sufficiency concept that means that without any government assistance, workers should be able to, working full-time perhaps, meet their basic needs? That might lead you to different kind of policy responses than if you're thinking about just kind of helping folks meet their basic needs, which is what our official poverty measure actually is a bit closer to identifying, because it also includes forms of cash aid. So I think that researchers have been weighing in on these issues. There's a lot of work going on these days on how to measure poverty, self-sufficiency, how do we try to understand the different populations and their needs and how policy might better address them. I think and I hope that our research is kind of contributing to that, in part by kind of thinking holistically and comprehensively about what resources families have and what it takes to make ends meet. And I do think policymakers are paying attention, as you heard at the beginning of the conference. California having the highest rate of poverty, that's based on these new statistics that have been developed by the Census Bureau and others over the last few years. So I guess the second thing I wanted to highlight was thinking about long-term, kind of how policy might respond to some of the long-term labor market challenges. And I might sound like a bit of an economist who's not really optimistic about the future, and thinking about the trends in the labor market that are so strong and have been going for decades now. And policymakers have pretty few tools to address just the bifurcation of kind of opportunities in our labor market, the polarization with regard to skill. If you look at the jobs that are projected for California over the next 10 years or so, the most in-demand jobs are for things like personal care aides, retail, cashiers, food preparation, and labor. And so I looked at the statistics recently, and out of the top 10 most in-demand jobs over the next decade, 8 of them pay less than, on average, $30,000 a year. So that's not particularly promising, I think, and we don't have a lot of policy tools that can move these kind of global trends towards what is demanded in the labor market and what opportunities are out there. Even if we could increase wages through the minimum wage, or even if they occurred, a wage increase occurred naturally, it still raises concerns in my mind, because a lot of those that type of work goes into services that the low-income working population relies on itself, like childcare and other types of assistance. So I think research that might highlight kind of the possible role of subsidizing, either subsidizing jobs, as Ann mentioned, or potentially subsidizing the type of services that support work, like childcare services and others. I think that might shed light on how to deal with some of these big long-term trends that otherwise we have pretty few policy tools to address. In the end, I think I tend to think about policy options that enhance mobility. At PPIC, we struggle with these kind of same policy challenges, and think about how poverty policy might both meet basic needs kind of in the short term, as well as enhance mobility in the long term. So I think a lot of the work on education is particularly promising, kind of addressing the kind of supply side concerns about the low wage work and increasing the kind of employability and skills of those who are kind of in these low wage jobs, so that it doesn't end up, the poverty among the working population doesn't end up being kind of a state where they remain, but is maybe more of a temporary state.
Hi everyone, my name is Kate Karpilow. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Women and Families. And I come to you not as an economist or as a traditional poverty researcher, though I have been reading about women in poverty pretty intensely over the last year. And I want to thank Ann for being one of my thought partners, really in some engaging conversations and letting me check what I think are sometimes rather bizarre conclusions, which sometimes are actually correct. So I'm trained as a social psychologist, and I worked in public policy for admittedly 30 years now. So I have a slightly different perspective, how I look at the questions, and I wanted to share some of those with you. And before I begin my prepared remarks, I want to acknowledge something that Congressman Aramendi said that I think is absolutely critical as a frame for this conversation, that the connection between the ability to bring academic research into the policy world is critical, but the tools about how we do that need to be expanded rather than even executive summaries. These kinds of conversations that we're having today are critical. But I think the other way that needs to happen is that the questions that the academic world takes on need to be more fully informed and shaped by policymakers and program people like the gentleman on my left and your right. What do they see that they need more information about? And I think that there are very simple ways to have roundtables that maybe won't accord with theoretical models, but accord with the lives of poor people. And so I just wanted to really add that to our, as one of the themes. So as a social psychologist, and they just affected my brain when I was in graduate school, you know, it's the person in a context, right? So when I look at poverty research, I think about who are the people who live above the poverty line and those who live below the poverty line, right? So there's different kinds of lines. There's different kinds of experiences going on. And a lot of the poverty research is just about that line, right? It's not about the lives as much as it is about the categories of people. And there are, as has been said, some really valuable discussions about how that line is created, which I think moves our thinking ahead. And it's not just wages, but it's standards of living, etc. So I want to focus on the lives, the strategies that people take, the choices and environmental context of the poor and the non-poor. So what I'm going to do is start with an observation from Ann's paper, and then offer some questions where I think, based on my reading over the last year, more research might prove fruitful. So observation and question number one. This sounds so basic, but some minimum wage workers live below the poverty line, and some do not, right? That's pretty basic, right? The research has to do, that I want to suggest, is looking at different individual strategies and environmental context for those two groups. So for example, what are the strategies that the non-poor minimum wage workers, non-poor minimum wage workers use in their daily lives to avoid poverty, right? Why is it that they're not poor when other minimum wage workers are poor? Is it that they have shared housing, childcare, more overtime? How do they make it work? And how, and this is important, sustainable are those individual practices? I think that researching this would probably necessitate some qualitative as well as quantitative research. A similar kind of mirrored question could be used for research on single parents, exploring how they avoid or climb out of poverty and what strategies, choices, and circumstances don't work for them. And I think that a special focus on parents in deep poverty or concentrated poverty in these circumstances would be especially enlightening, as would insights on any gender differences between single moms and single dads, because both of those populations are growing. So all of this kind of looking at the individual choices and strategies does not mean to in any way ignore the deeper structural forces that cause poverty. But I think when people are in similar circumstances, it's fair to look at their coping mechanisms. Observation in question number 2 relates to community colleges. As the paper pointed out and in her remarks, there's mixed, but mostly positive or mixed kind of outcomes on the value of technical education. And why is this so important for low-income and immigrant communities? In immigrant communities, community colleges really are a gateway for advancement. They're really a critical way to step up economically. So the questions I bring to this are how much research teases out in the community college tech ed world, how much self-selection and institutional channeling of women into low-paying pink-collar jobs happens at these institutions. This is a really important question because we know community colleges certificate folks for childcare and preschool, as well as construction jobs, and the economic advantage of those different professions are significant. A related question: are the community colleges doing a particularly good job of helping women, in particular, move to non-traditional, better-paying jobs? So, is channeling occurring? But what kind of insights, support, and education is happening in order to move more women into the trades, essentially? Observation number 3, the paper notes that education remains one of the strongest indicators of who will escape and move on from poverty. Absolutely, I think that's probably the most important. However, number of children is also a really good predictor. You look at those charts, you go from 1 to 5, and the numbers just change drastically about who, no matter what your family composition is, about the percentages that are in poverty. So the question that I have for all of you, and the researchers in particular, I think, on this, is that, hold on a second, is that what can we do to increase the focus on this? And what does that mean? Elizabeth Sawhill's work from Brookings is probably the most notable on teen pregnancy and the impacts of early parenting. But we need more in the poverty research world and the poverty policy world, more conversation about contraception, family planning, and yes, abortion. Because these are topics that people talk about in their daily lives. And the research community, the poverty research community, needs to not ghettoize those issues as women's health or reproductive health. Also, I've always wondered, when you have sexually active teenagers, and most of them are these days, how many of them were to see those graphs of having a child at 16 and what it means for the prediction of your life in poverty, what that could do as a tool to help kids make wiser decisions about contraception, etc. I also think, quite honestly, as far as proposals, that we need a national agenda on these issues, that we should have a conference on these issues to really explore the nuances and the links and set an agenda. And finally, my last point is, I think we need to do more, I call it to flip the question, when we look at the working poor. As part of poverty research, a lot of these things really get segmented. So we need to look at employers who don't pay living wages, right? So that's in the news a lot, the income inequality. And clearly, employers that don't pay living wages are receiving corporate subsidies. There's more talk about that. But as part of poverty research, those institutions are trapping people in lives of poverty. So what kind of questions might we ask? And here are some. What is it about the corporate culture that makes this okay? That's a great research question. What's the psychology there? Are they aware? Are they even aware that some of their employees are receiving food stamps, etc.? It hasn't dawned on them. What are the justifications that they use for valuing profit over people? What is the culture of their boards of directors? how far would reduced hours actually go in boosting worker wages? In short, researchers could go a long way in shifting and shining a brighter strobe light on workplace practices that justify not providing living wages. And that summarizes my comments. Yes.
Seems to pick up pretty good. I'll just move over here a little bit. So I want to commend the UC Davis Poverty Institute here on its work. And I think we are seeing a trend in looking at this serious issue much more closely. You're probably also aware that Stanford has an institute there, and just last month, the Community Action Agency Association that we belong to co-sponsored a summit on poverty there as well. We haven't seen much of it in the public policy arena, especially at the national level. And Speaker Ryan is now on record as coming out with his policy for trying to abate poverty and the strategies that might work best there. It really is an important dialogue to have, and I think, Kate, you mentioned it should be a national dialogue that we enter into. I particularly like the Congressman's tee up for this event here. He mentioned Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. The agency that I'm a part of is a community action agency, one of 1,100 in the nation, and we were birthed the year after that legislation was approved. You might find this a little bit interesting and odd and surprising, but we're in Fresno, and Fresno is not nearly the size of New York or Los Angeles or Detroit or other major cities in our nation. But we are probably either first or second largest in the entire nation among those 1,100. And I think that in part that is appropriate because, as I was discussing with my colleague here, the Brookings Institute a number of years ago came out to point out that Fresno had, in one of its zip codes, the highest concentration of poverty in the nation, even more than New Orleans that went through Katrina at that time. So it's not the kind of notoriety that we enjoy, but I think that the fact that we've had strong leadership over the years, be able to create good programs and models to address poverty is significant. I am not an economist either. I am standing in at the last moment for a colleague that wasn't able to be here, and I just returned from a week in Washington, D.C. Lobbying for water. And so my comments are the result of work I did on a stretch from Washington to Salt Lake City yesterday. So, I did spend 11 years at California State University, Fresno, in their faculty of philosophy. So we have a lot of different disciplines up here, philosophy, and then after that is when I got involved with the Community Action Agency. In part, for a real interest in trying to explore, because I've always been interested in this subject matter, but trying to figure out, what practical solutions could we introduce, could we test, and look into. So I did that over a number of years, and then I was asked to assume the role of a chief innovation officer with the organization I'm with, so I have kind of a fun job because now I've got some experience in how these programs work and what new twists we might be able to introduce to have even better results. And so I spent a lot of time working on that. Probably the most important part of my career, and I think I don't see anything ever trumping that, were the 17 years that I spent as founder and then director of a conservation corps in Fresno. You may be aware that there are 13 of these institutions statewide, and what was so compelling about that is that I had the opportunity to test programs, but to see on a day-to-day basis young people that came to the site and what their barriers were to employment, and it was really quite remarkable. Unfortunately, in the first few years, I went to a lot of funerals because we had a lot of gang-involved youth in these programs. I was the only Caucasian individual in the entire program of the first 50 that were there, and And so I saw something that was really quite startling, quite stunning, and I came face to face with some of the realities that people in poverty encounter on a day-to-day basis. The fact that most of them either skateboarded, walked, carpooled, rollerblade, they got to work that way, and we started at 5:30 in the morning. It was just remarkable. They bussed, and sometimes the buses weren't running at certain points to be able to help them get there. Substance abuse was rampant. I didn't realize this, but probably 95% of the young people we had tested positive, and they didn't know anything about work for the most part. They didn't know anything about authority. And I kind of boil it down after a few years. If I could address two things, just two things, we could make remarkable progress. And these are things that you may find rather basic, but if I could get them there to work every day, that would be a huge hurdle. Because young people that I worked with thought that working 3 out of 5 days, working 4 out of 5 days was exceptional, and didn't understand that if you didn't work 5 out of 5 days in the real world, you were not going to be employed very long. The second thing I encountered was attitude. And this, again, is something that, if you are raised in a family that teaches respect, this comes rather natural to you, but, and it's fine when you go through an orientation for 5 days in a nice, comfortable room, but as soon as you get out and somebody says to you, I need you to pick up the trash over there, and then, the expletives follow, and you don't understand why, and you equate this with racism and a number of other things, and then you lose your job. Unfortunately, in the program we ran, we offered a second chance opportunity. But these are the kinds of things that we encountered, and so I'm hoping that what I can offer here on this panel is sort of the practical side to this, and offer some models that I think should be explored. I'm just going to go straight to the models because I know we're short on time here, but there are a couple of things, and I want to build on what you had, Ann, in your paper, the subsidized employment. You noted that the research is mixed, and with some sizable increases in income, however. I think that the Conservation Corps model is one that, in my experience, has been researched, it's been evaluated, and the evaluations are really quite remarkable in terms of outcomes. So I would go back to, what's the history of all this? Well, the Civilian Conservation Corps from 33 to 41. When FDR, and again, Congressman mentioned FDR did this in his first 100 days in office and produced a program that put 2 million young men. There would be women today, but at that time, it was a male program, and they did remarkable things. So what did they do? And we see evidence of it even today. Roads and bridges and railways, parks, trails, urban forestry, emergency services, fires and floods, all those kinds of things. So it lasted 9 years. Our governor, Jerry Brown, reintroduced it in California in 1976. Good for him, because there's been considerable growth since that time. Another program I just visited before I went to Washington is the Cypress Mandela Center. I don't know how many of you are aware of that in Oakland. They also have centers, I think, in Las Vegas and maybe other places in California, but built around the same idea. That you have discipline, you have structure, you have mentoring, and you teach skills by doing. I know that you mentioned that in your paper. The applied approach. I've seen a lot of workforce programs where you bring somebody into a classroom and you try to teach workforce skills, by lecturing and by introducing theory. And I don't think that works very well. So if you want to teach somebody nutrition, what we used to do is to teach them by having them cook. And when you cook, you enjoy a meal, you see what the ingredients are in it, you're more likely to understand why it is that you're going to cook the way you do. So the second is SIBs, social impact bonds, a relatively new idea. Came out of the UK, there are models in New York City, and we are actually going to have a conference in October in Fresno on social impact bonds, and I will get the word out, and hopefully, we'd like to have some good practitioners there, to discuss that and see how we can put that into play. Well, the reason for that is because a lot of government programs haven't really demonstrated to be as effective as they could be. And I understand as a practitioner because we go to Washington regularly to lobby for programs that are important to us. And everybody does the same thing. So when that budget gets approved, the budget is the result of a lot of lobbying and a lot of line items that continue year after year after year, but not necessarily producing the kind of value that we would like to see. So these are basically pay for success programs. So here's a thought. Here's a thought, and this is just an example. If you consider the amount of subsidy or support that poor people that are not working, even those that are working, get, it can be TANF, SNAP, housing assistance through housing authorities, a number of those things. But if you took that and took the value or the equivalent of the monetary value of that and paid wages instead, and put those individuals to work on public works projects, what do you think might happen? And I think, there's just an abundance of work. They don't have to take the jobs of people who are already employed because budgets are strapped anyways. We can't find enough workers to do the work that has to be done. So I think that would probably help with what you mentioned, those that have been unemployed for 8 months or so, and even if they show it on their resume, are far less likely to be working again. We want to give people an opportunity to work continuously throughout the course of the year. This is one example that we might be able to do it. And if we found investors that saw value in this approach, they would take the risk, not the government, but would use existing sources of funds that pay the wages and the program infrastructure and put people to work that way. What are the benefits of that? I think they're probably quite clear no matter where you are in the political spectrum. It's always better to have wage earners and consumers in our economy. The second is that work is a far better alternative than dependence on social welfare. The third is the positive impact that this would have on future generations. And fourth, presumably these people have the opportunity to become homeowners, have pride of neighborhood, reduce crime, and the like. Gross, that you cite on page 15 in your paper, says we need to scale proven program models. So I think, go back to this, we definitely need to have more of a discussion. And I didn't realize there wasn't a whole lot of research on these kinds of programs, but I think we need it. And if that were to occur, then we'd have the opportunity to sort of dissect this and determine and scale those that have proven to be most effective. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. So thanks to all of you. My goal is to keep us only 15 minutes behind, so that gives us 3.5. Maybe we can go to 17 minutes behind. We have slack in the schedule later. So if there are a couple of questions from the audience, please. Is this the only microphone? Do I have to come out? Sure. Here.
Hi, thank you for your comments. One area that I feel, and I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't know if this is something, but I feel like I haven't seen this intersection, is the role of workers' comp in this area. As you know, low-wage work tends to be a high-risk injury work, and when you look at workers' comp research, most of the research tends to focus on cost to the employer, and that's usually generally the indicator of success. As costs go down, laws are currently working. I don't know, I think there was an article, I think it was this week, about workers' comp, and they were saying that, the last round of law changes have been successful because costs seem to be going in the right direction, and we shouldn't think about changing workers' comp until, we do it about once a decade. But one thing I've never really seen is how being on workers' comp impacts poverty in the long term. I haven't seen that research. When we look at, intersection between poverty and health, you tend to see more research on, the poor have chronic health problems, diabetes or whatever, because they're not getting access to care, or about insurance, or about regular health insurance. But what you don't see is workers' comp. And I think that's something that's always been very interesting to me. I don't actually know, whether or not employers are actually complying with workers' comp laws. Do they, it's well known that low-wage workers are subject to a lot of violations. They don't know their rights. So, are we actually, when we see these rosy numbers of costs to employers going down, whether or not that's actually reflecting what's really happening, and that's an area for further research. And, I think it goes, when somebody's out on workers' comp, they are, to their family, what impact does that have on their children? All they know is that their parents seem to be not at work. And it may be for an extended period of time. In their minds, it may be the same as being unemployed, although from society's perspective, they're not unemployed because they're on disability or some other insurance. Thanks.
Any quick thoughts from the panel? I will just say I think that is an area that in all the poverty research that I know and come across, I encounter that very rarely. So it is interesting because I'm sure you're correct that there are many of the poor that's a critical program for. We don't know much about it at all. Maybe another question?
Hi, thank you. I'm curious to know regarding the research on minimum wage. You mentioned that there is, usually when there's an increase, there's then a dip in job availability. And I'm wondering, is there any research on how long that dip lasts? Is it a lasting dip in job availability, or is there a dip and then a subsequent increase?
I think that's a great and complicated question. I see my fellow economist grinning that I have the microphone and not her. I think what the studies that do show reductions in employment, the part assumption and part empirical finding from those studies is that you raise the wage, as long as the wage stays higher, this often small reduction in employment is there. The tricky thing about the minimum wage, as in my view, in the way US policy handles it, is that we never really make lasting changes in the minimum wage because we refuse to consider indexing it to inflation. And so it's a really hard question to answer because if you raise the minimum wage by 50%, well, say something more realistic, 30%, it tends to stick there for years. And every year, inflation from 1% to 3% to in some years 4% erodes it. And so it's kind of a moving target, which I think is one reason we sometimes, this is my own speculation, that we sometimes don't see so much employment change because employers sort of know that yes, the minimum wage is going up, but they're not going to touch it for another 5 years, so it's going to gradually come back down. It's very complicated to model that and model what employers think is going to happen to the minimum wage in real terms in the future. It's a good question and we don't know the answer. So maybe, okay, one more. Alan.
Thank you. My name is Alan Stansberry. I'm the policy research analyst for the Center for Community Futures in Berkeley, and I have to applaud you for your outstanding presentations. They're really excellent. And a couple of things that you brought up for my interest is that one of the things that we could use a little bit more research on. I have read extensively about wage theft, which is rampant throughout the United States, and some of the people that have researched this said that we could end wage theft, we could do a lot about ending poverty. That is to say, all too often, this is a definition of wage theft, is that we have employees who are shortchanged on their hours. They don't give the appropriate timeline on scheduling, and lots of times they'll get paid overpaid. There's this whole thing about misclassification that employers seem to do a lot. And of course, there's the new issue dealing with overtime. And as you know, that somebody may know that President Obama has signed an executive order to double the time amount of overtime wages, so that the minimum is no longer set at $23,000, but at somewhere around $50,000. So I would encourage more research in the area things like wait staff, misclassification, and so on and so forth.
All right, thanks again to our panel.